Empire at War has a lot of its own cut content, but that's probably even more true of some of the mods. Thrawn's Revenge has been in development for over 17 years, and in that time we've cut a lot of features, which we're going to cover today, including raid fleets, diplomacy, and more. Some because they were terrible ideas, and others for some other reasons. Not all of these features made it all the way into a public release, but I'm going to be sticking to talking about things which got fully implemented before being removed, rather than just plans that fell through. That could fill like 7 other videos. One of the earliest big features we cut was Friendly Fire, which did make it into the earliest releases in 2010. Projectiles fired from units were able to hit other friendly units if positioned incorrectly, meaning you'd be able to damage your own ships and vehicles. While this may sound interesting in theory, in practice unit and firing control in Empire at War just isn't deep enough, so it was more frustrating than interesting. The biggest problem was making the AI understand it, which we may have a better idea on how to work around these days, but the result was still a lot of orbital bombardments and bombing runs taking out their own troops. In some cases, when we cut stuff, it does come back after some time. Having a number of active factions has always been one of the things I like most about Thrawn's Revenge personally, and this was there from the earliest days. The 1.0 version of the mod actually had the Hutts, the Avethans, Pentastar Linemen, and Warlord Zinj as non-playable but active factions on the galactic map. The Pentastar Linemen and Warlord Zinj stuck around and got more fleshed out over time, as did the Avethans. But the Avethans eventually got cut despite even having their own galactic conquest. This was because of limited faction slots in the game before it would just start crashing when battles were initiated. Luckily, a more recent official game patch has meant we can start re-adding them along with other planned factions, but it's been a long time coming. The Hapens similarly took a long time before they regained an active galactic level AI after this early version, and while the Hutts are returning as a new playable faction in 3.4, they were gone for over a decade in basically any form. They originally used a bunch of free release assets made by a modder named Warb Null, but as we went more in the direction of making our own assets, these were cut and the faction was removed. One of our bigger cut projects, which was only ever released as a standalone test on our forums, were Diplomats. Unfortunately, the build for this one is gone, so I had to splice together some of what we still had for it into another old build for the footage you're seeing here. But basically, planets were divided into different sectors, and each faction could deploy a diplomat to a planet. Having a diplomat over a planet would increase your influence on that planet. Owning multiple planets in a sector would increase your influence on other planets in that sector, eventually flipping those planets. The way it was, it made things really snowbally within a sector, and ultimately we felt this made avoiding combat the most efficient way to conquer most planets, rather than using it to reinforce other game mechanics, so it wasn't able to stick around in that form, though we do have other kinds of influence now. Tactical battles had several things cut as well, especially in space. Units are technically tactical things, I guess, and there were a variety of units tied to both the cut factions like the Hutt Speeders and the Bloodstar, and then the still playable factions like the Wingless MC-80 and the Nebulon B-2 for the New Republic. The Empire of the Hand even had its own set of dedicated star bases and ground structures, but these tended to not look particularly great, so they went back to using the Imperial structures on ground and a mix of their own newer designs for defensive structures in space. There was a long period where the main level 1 to 5 star bases in the mod were handled as the shipyards, so standard star bases like what they weren't necessary anymore, and instead we moved towards things like Golans. Then when we moved back to the level 1 through 5 star base being the main star base, we still use those different Golan levels. Most units which have been cut have eventually come back in some form, or will come back in some form someday. Sadly, that may even be the case with the Nebulon B-2, despite my regular protests. Before some of the projectile reworks, most lasers in the mod had a Flack projectile attached, which would basically show an explosion randomly around the battle somewhere. I actually still think in some cases this was a fun visual that added something, but considering we only had one version of the explosion tied to it, and we had a ton of projectiles everywhere, it could distract from useful information and was a big part of the mod just having way too much going on visually. If there was a bit more variety and there was a lower level of laser saturation or just a lower chance for the flak to show up, I think it could still be a cool idea, though it's not something we plan to revisit. On the topic of projectiles, there was an earlier implementation of the Empire of the Hand's Mega Mazers, which was more of a solid beam of projectiles. It was created entirely accidentally, and I don't have any footage or pictures of it anymore, but it looked pretty cool and was very laggy, which is why we got rid of it. You'll just have to take my word for it, I can't show you it, but it's one of the things that did come up when I told the team this was a video I was making. There are two particular base game features that we cut, but were actually in the mod for a long time: Buildable Fighters and Fog of War in Space. For Buildable Fighters, having a bunch of them on the galactic map belonging to the AI contributed significantly to lag, and we felt like the number available from building carriers was generally more than enough if players wanted to focus that direction. Though with the potential future project having a smaller scale of combat, there may be room for them to make a return. With Fog of War, it was present for a long time in space, and in a vacuum it's better to have it, but generally in most mods, it ends up meaning you have one ship you send across the map and then jump everything in, meaning it just contributed to waiting and having smaller battles feel especially repetitive. But it is something we really do want to reintroduce if we're able to get around some of the reasons that we removed it in the first place. One of the reasons to have Fog of War back would be related to doing more with map control and in-battle events and hazards. Having more of the map being used in the final cut content for today is one of my favorite mechanics we had related to that. It was actually cut fairly recently compared to some of the other things we've covered today, so you may actually still remember it being in the game. These are raid fleets. This mechanic had fleets belonging to a third faction randomly jumping into some battles. The final campaign mission in Forces of Corruption was super fun and was the only real way three-way battles were ever seen in the game, aside from just the militia and ground battles in some cases, and that was something we wanted to be a lot more common. They could lead to some great three-way fights and make otherwise skewed battles doable if they were played around well. The flip side was that they were entirely random and they were abusable by hiding away from the fleet, but it was another area where I always felt that the benefits were worth the drawbacks. We always wanted to tie them more into what was going on in the galactic map rather than being full-on RNG, so upgrades for them were something that we really wanted to do even while they were present. But as the faction rosters for the Imperial factions got updated and some other mechanics changed and other factions got introduced to the game, the feature became fairly buggy and difficult to upkeep. So the raid fleets were cut until a new version could be made rather than continuing to do the upkeep in that form. That's it for at least our first set of cut content from Thrawn's Revenge. I could probably do even a second edition of this if I started digging a little bit deeper, and if people are interested, maybe I could even just go into more detail on some of what we covered today, especially the units. Either way, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.